What we have today, when we were planning this, we always refer to it internally as OER 101. This is designed to give you the basic information, what you need to know to understand what this business of open educational resources is all about. And we've got three people who will be providing input to the day. Andy Lane is the most knowledgeable person in the university on OERs, and he'll be sharing his knowledge and experience with you at the beginning of the day and again at the last section. We have Non Scandalbury, who works at the OU Library, talking about finding OERs and some of the tools and techniques for identifying and evaluating OER and identifying whether it's suitable for your purposes. After lunch, we have Bernie Atwell, who's over here already. Bernie is our expert on licensing and rights, and she'll be talking about that. And licensing is absolutely at the heart of OERs, and so she'll be unpacking that for you. And I'll be around today, and please do ask me. I should have introduced myself at the beginning. I'm Jonathan Darby, Director of SCORE. So if there's anything more you'd like to know about SCORE and what we do, please just ask. One last thing just to mention here. We have two types of fellowship program in SCORE. We have short-term fellowships, and what you're getting today is one of the days of the short-term fellowship program, which involves a week's intensive experience, intensive work on OERs here at the OU, with a strong hands-on and practical element to it. So if at the end of today you feel you'd like more, applying for a short-term fellowship is one possible way of taking it forward. And then we have regular fellowships, and this is where individuals work on projects that they have devised and that are relevant to them in their work context. And we will shortly be issuing another invitation to apply for regular fellowships. So those are two things that you might be interested in after this. Anyway, so much for the commercial. Let me now hand over to Andy Lane, who will talk you through OER usage and other aspects.
Actually, it's a different title. Making education more open with open educational resources. Well, thank you for the introduction, Jonathan. What I'm going to be talking about this morning and this afternoon is partly about how the Open University has gone about things, but also to set open educational resources in the wider context, to use the experience that has been gained now by ourselves over 5 years. It is 5 years since we began with what has become Open Learn, although Open Learn is just but one of a number of open educational resource initiatives that are now being done at the OU or involving the OU. But much more that will come later this afternoon, where I'll talk about what else is happening in the UK and much further afield around the world. This morning I just want to talk about some of the conceptual and experiential aspects of open educational resources that have come up for ourselves in the past 5 years, but obviously also picking up on some of the things which have happened in the wider movement, which has now been going for at least 10 years, if not longer. So, the opportunity. I mean, the opportunity for open educational resources is being made by or set out by many different people. There's a first quote there from OECD. Next one from Sir John Daniel, former Vice-Chancellor of this university, Assistant Director General UNESCO, and now President of the Commonwealth of Learning. And also something from, at the bottom there, for Sir Ron Cook, until recently was the chair of the Joint Information Systems Committee. As the beginning of a definition set out there with the first one from the OECD report, that open education resources are digitised materials offered freely and openly for educators and students and self-learners to use and reuse for teaching, learning and research. First point, I question, they don't always have to be digitised. Just because everything is digitised now doesn't mean open education resources or something still in paper form like this cannot be an open education resource. It is. But of course, much of the sort of dominant thinking is about stuff that's being made available through the internet, through the web in different ways, and of course it is digitised. But you can see here that people believe there are big opportunities from open educational resources, that this offers something that we have not perhaps had before. And I'll try to unpack some of those elements. Because in terms of saying what is the meaning of open in open educational resources, you might think it's easy to say an educational resources are, well, it's a whole variety of things which might be provided. They might be a PowerPoint presentation, it might be lecture notes, it might be a video of a lecture, it might be specially prepared materials. Education resources are those things which are supporting the educational process, which are put together and which students can study from. So concentrating on the open bit of open educational resources, I like to use this graphic and things from Gazer. It's a paper in e-learning papers, but I think it's also, because Gazer also worked on the OLCOS roadmap 2010 project, you'll also find it there. So the first aspect they see is about openness, and these are sort of degrees of openness. Not all open education resources necessarily have to have all these things, but to be as open as possible in this definition, they must be open access. So you must be provided free of charge, you must be able to get hold of them. They must be openly licensed. We've already heard, and Bernie will talk about that this afternoon, the open license is important. In fact, if you look at the UNESCO definition, the 2002 definition of open education resources, and most other definitions, they talk about it being openly licensed because it is the license, generally, depends on the type of license, which allows for the reuse and the reworking, the adaptation, the ability to modify or reuse the things that comes under that license. There's plenty of material out there which is openly accessible, but it's full copyright. You might still be able to download it for personal use, as you can off iTunes U. So anything you download for iTunes U, if it's still under their terms and conditions, not Creative Commons license, you can't modify it. You can use it for personal use, you can't give it to anybody else. You are breaching the terms of the license. So the license is important. You hear much more about that, and understanding the licenses is important. But as I talk about later, open education resources, in that strict definition, is not all there is. Open access resources can also be used for educational purposes. And so we have to look at this in terms of the different uses, the different people involved in the educational process, because how they view something that's openly available, an educational resource openly available, it can be different to how we or others might see it in terms of being educators or teachers who wish to modify, repurpose and reuse, and to really sort of bring out the full scale of opportunities that sharing material can offer. Because at the end of the day, open education resources, this is about sharing materials with people for some purpose. The third item there is open format. Produce an open format designed for easy reuse. Now it might seem to be an arcane point here, but some people would say that it's much better for things to be in an open format, perhaps say through open office, open source software material, because it is, as it says, an openly licensed product as well. Not Microsoft Office, which actually is a proprietary product. but effectively, although Microsoft Office and, say, Word is a proprietary product, what you produce with it is yours. It's not governed by that same license, so you can share it. So for many people, the distinctions do not matter in practice. And again, there is this element of trying to distinguish between what might be called the sort of the in-principle view of some of these aspects. And you say, well, in principle, it should be like this, to in what happens in practice. In practice, for a lot of people, it doesn't matter if things are in an openly licensed format, because many of the formats, standard formats that are available in which you find open education resources are easily shareable, are easily reusable. There are exceptions to that, but I mean, it happens to be the case. And also, that bottom one fits in that well as well, that it's the open software. So you're using open software to produce it. But as I say, those sort of distinctions are not necessarily always as clear. So we're returning to some of these things, but at the most extreme side, you can have things which have all those features, are open access, open licensed, and the most open license, it might be just the attribution license, it might be an open format produced by open source software. But you can have at this end, you can still have something which might just be open access, still full copyright license, not openly licensed, not an open format, but open software, but it can still be used within educational processes. So there is just this vast range, and understanding the licenses and sort of implications of them can be important. It might seem daunting, but there are some simple aspects around it, and it's just a lot of obfuscation comes in because people just get mixed up between the principles behind this and the practice, what you can do in practice. So there are many aspects and issues to do with open educational resources, and here's a word of, I can't remember what it was, but it just gives lots of terms related around, particularly a lot of the research and evaluation work that we've done here at the OU around it, and a lot of the features that come out of it, about the users, the design, the research, evaluation, the content, analytics, examples, all sorts of things. But at the heart of it is that things about users and learning and use, which I think come out quite strongly. So why make open educational resources, or make educational resources open under those circumstances? And here's where I talk about why the OU did it. These are the reasons why the OU went into it. It might not be the reasons that other institutions went into it, or why other institutions might go into it. There's the actual particularities of this. There are some general ones, but more often than not, the sort of decisions to do this have to be very particular to the individual, the organisation involved. I mean, first up, there's this growing momentum behind open educational resources. This was happening. We came into it 5 years after MIT first really brought open educational resources to the forefront when they launched their open courseware initiative they announced in 2001 and started releasing courses in 2002. Although, as I talk about a bit this afternoon, the concept of open content, open educational content and resources was actually around about 5 years before that, at a much lower level. For the university, and the title gives it away, the Open University, open educational resources are obviously consistent, do fit with the sort of social mission that the university has and has been given in its Royal Charter, to be open as to people, places, methods and ideas, to provide for the educational well-being of the wider community. Those things are set out in there, and so it just resonates a lot with what the Open University does in terms of being an open access institution. So that was fairly clear. Third one down, helps build market and reputation. Let's be honest. You might think that sharing, there's some altruistic things in here, but we're not just doing this because it is a good thing. That the university or our new Vice-Chancellor, Martin Bean, likes to talk about the sort of double bottom line for the university. We have to, obviously, as an institution, education institution like all universities, make sure we use the resources we have available wisely, that we, at the end of the year, are financially sound and can still operate in the future. And we have to balance that up with that social justice mission, the other sort of bottom line. So we're making that sort of balance about doing things which is about working with others, sharing and being open, but also seeing, and this will sort of come back to this, how open educational resources and other aspects of openness also further the general activities of the university around teaching, outreach and research. In particular, on that, we thought it would help bridge the divide between formal and informal learning. The sort of formal structured learning which is provided from universities that has the academic credit, the courses, the modules, the qualifications we provide, as opposed to that informal adult learning, much more loosely structured, things that happen out there that people do largely in their own time, possibly for interest but other things. But in terms of being able to bridge between the two, we thought that was important because it's been something we have been doing ever since we had started. Because of our relationship with the BBC, we've always had this situation where we've had the free-to-air broadcasting of both course-related and other general programming. So we've always had this aspect of open access resources out there, largely through the medium of television and radio, getting out there. So we'd already been doing some things in a particular way for some time, and we already knew that people who saw our programmes, some of them would then be interested in what the Open University do and then want to sign up for courses with us or perhaps sign up for courses with other institutions. That's sort of part of what we see, that the sort of bridging between the formal and informal about being is about getting people into higher education in some way. We also saw this as a test bed for new e-learning developments and an opportunity to research and evaluate them. This was particularly the case, as you may be aware, when we started 5 years ago. We started with a big bang because we thought, after we'd done the internal evaluation about what we should do, that if we're going to do something, we'd have to do it big because we wouldn't really sort of get the impact, we really wouldn't understand the impacts of open education resources unless we did something sizable. And so in the negotiations we had with the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, we put together the sort of 2-year startup period where we had a total budget of it's nearly £5.5 million to get going. So a lot of money to get going, but it was seen as important to do it on that scale, to be able to test things, because without doing things at large scale, we felt we wouldn't really understand what it is that people would want and get from it. I mean, there's a complete history of lots of ICT-based projects that have been funded over the past 15, 20 years, which have been all very well while they've run, but then just closed as soon as the startup funding was going. And often they didn't really learn enough from what they did to be able to understand how to sustain and keep the things going. And this is one of the biggest issues in the whole OER movement, is about how do you sustain this activity. If we're giving stuff away for free, who pays for it? And we'll come back to that. So it's important for the university to really be able to sort of test that out, to evaluate that in depth. We really needed to know that whether this was viable or not. And I'll come back to whether it's still viable or not later. We also saw it as a way of drawing in materials from other organisations. A fundamental aspect of the whole movement, as I've already said, is about sharing content with others so that they can use it. And it's meant to be about two-way sharing, so it's not about just you giving, it's also about you being able to take back. And this is on the basis of that producing educational resources, particularly if you're producing rich media, very heavy in audio, video, animation or whatever things, these are costly to produce. Spend a hell of a lot of money producing these things, and it's better if more people see it and use it than a few. And the sort of reinvention of wheels in terms of educational resources is enormous. It's understandable because of the way much of education, particularly higher education, is set up and has been for a long time, but it is enormously wasteful in a certain extent. Now, I mean, the Open University, because it produces educational resources, because of the way we teach in terms of supported open learning, students at a distance, a lot of the teaching is done through producing these bespoke educational resources, although we do use materials from a lot of other places. And Bernie would talk about, we incorporate a lot of third-party material into some of that student learning materials. But we spend an awful lot of money doing that. We probably spend something near £80 million per annum doing that. We've got 250,000 students, and spreading that cost around 250,000 students, it comes down to small things. The more students you have, obviously the unit cost of doing that, but it's a hell of a lot of money to be spending on that type of things. Now, those materials are also can be used by other institutions under license and things like that, and there are many institutions around the world who do use our content, and we reciprocate in some cases. We've used other people's content, but we don't do enough of it, and the cost of producing this very high quality pedagogic material is such that it's better if we can cooperate and collaborate either directly or indirectly through sharing and doing these things, because the sort of cost of producing these resources is not going to diminish, it's going to likely to increase, and so it's the benefit of everybody across the sector, across worldwide, to be able to try and defray some of that time and cost and effort that's involved, and to be able to share it, particularly if it's sort of in publicly funded education. And that is one of the principal aspects, as I talked about this afternoon, certainly in the UK, with the JISC and HEA-funded UK OER programme. One of the biggest drivers behind that is that hopefully to kick-start the sharing of open educational resources in the UK HE sector, that it is long-term, will hopefully try to reduce some of the cost and effort in producing resources. Because if there's less cost and effort in producing the resources, then as institutions, higher education institutions, we might be able to put a little bit more effort into the sort of tuition or student support to help the students in terms of direct contact rather than sort of indirect contact with this. So it's also there about if we can save monies in producing resources, then we can also redirect some of those resources to other things, which will hopefully lead to better outcomes for students and learners in general. And lastly, is providing the basis for worldwide collaborations. I mean, the university already has quite a number of different national and international collaborations. We feel that open education resources offers new ways and different ways to be able to do that, and possibly on the collaboration of producing open educational resources, and more of that this afternoon. So why has some of this come about? David Wiley, when you get into this area, you'll find David Wiley, anybody can be labelled as either the father or grandfather of open educational resources is David Wiley. He's now associate professor at Brigham Young University, but when he was a researcher there, he got involved into a lot of things about learning objects. You probably heard about learning objects and digital things like that. And he looked at the open source software movement and the things and the licensing there and thought, wouldn't it be great if we had something similar for content? And he put together the first open content license, which he put together himself. He's not a lawyer, but he put something together trying to take things from the free document license that was already available in terms of open source software movement. It was about 3 or 4 years after he did that in the mid-90s that a few people, again in the US, also looked at this and were worried about how copyright law was going, particularly in the US, but worldwide, and how they felt it was locking down the potential for creativity and wealth creation, although many of the people wanting stricter copyright laws were saying exactly the same. But they felt it was locking things down, and this led to the formation of the Creative Commons organisation, and these were lawyers, and they put together licenses, you'll hear about later, which really sort of set out in more strict legal terms, both precise ways in which content of all sorts. It wasn't just about open educational resources there, Creative Commons, because it was about all types of content, and of course some of it has had its most immediate impact in terms of music and video sharing and things like that. So this came about, and so David Wiley has talked about the trends in there. They thought that the things which have been happening in recent years, certainly that past 10 or 20 years, is that we've been moving from things which have been analogue to digital. I talked about that, but a lot of things are being done either face-to-face or they're doing Xeroxed and such like, the hand notes, or if anybody can remember acetates. I've drawn many an acetate in my life and using those with overhead projectors. Everything was analogue, things like that. Difficult to reproduce, difficult to hand out, all handcrafted. Those things have moved over to being digital. And we all know it's much easier to do, much easier to share things that are digital, much easier to copy them. You can create infinite copies, you can share them all around with different people. Things are moving from being tethered to being mobile. Obviously, this is really sort of taking off now, but it's the case that sort of 20 years ago, everything like a phone, it was tied down to somewhere. Where now you're sort of taking it around with you, and with smartphones, you're sort of taking a computer around with you now. Whereas at one time they were a big thing on your desk which you couldn't carry anywhere. So things have got more mobile, and that sort of changed things, and is supporting things like the open and distance learning movement, which obviously Open University is about, but obviously many other institutions are beginning to get into distance learning, where you can say you don't have to bring the people to you to be able to teach them, to educate them. You can try and go to them. So it's about changing the sort of mindset and realising that the ways in which education might be organised is not in terms of classrooms or rooms like this. In terms of this, that's still part of it. But equally, you can do it virtually now. You can do it things, or you can do it in different ways. It's sort of breaking down those barriers and thinking that the sort of industrial education method provided by campus-based institutions and even schools and things could be different now. It's also moving from being isolated to connected, and again it's all that information communication technologies that generally people are doing things on their own, the sort of connections that people might have within, say, a school or a university with another university, another school, are very much more limited. They're limited by the available technology, which is changing. People can be in touch, people can hold a meeting even though they're in 6 different time zones around the world at the same time, and sort of cope with that fine. And even schools now have these links and things to other schools in other countries, the other side of the world, things which were not possible 20 years ago. And again, it's this contact, the way that people can be more connected to more people than was ever the case before. Also talks about the way that technologies and other things are moving more from the sort of generic to the personal. And that's because there is this feeling there's a change of locus of control in some of these things, educational systems, in things that everything is provided for you. It's a one-size-fits-all way of providing an education, whether it be a degree or schooling or whatever it is, to there being much more different ways, more flexible ways of doing that, to try, if not personalise it for an individual, but personalise it for different types of people in their interests. The idea of open distance learning, again, is about it's more personalised or offering other opportunities. If you've got the choice between campus-based and distance learning based, it's the different things. If you've got a choice between full-time and part-time, just the different ways and modes in which education is now possible is winding up, and some of that means that more of the sort of locus of control or sort of decisions about how the education experience might be structured or can be in the hands of the learner as it is in the hands of the teacher. Right. It's a stark contrast between, it's not quite so stark over there and over there, but the general drift is that there's greater ability to personalise how you learn, what you learn, when you learn, particularly informal learning, if not informal learning, with new technologies. There's also, obviously, the move that, whereas previously everybody was consumer, you might be a consumer of educational products and educational resources, it's now so much more easier for you also to be a creator. For groups of people, students can be creators, students create resources as well as teachers, but all sorts of people, and they can equally make them available to everybody and anybody, and they do in all sorts of different ways, whether it's on YouTube with their little videos, or whether it's through Facebook or whatever. And it follows this general thing that things are being moved from more being closed, they're within the walls of here, they're not shared with other people, and it's not just a sort of about the licensing, it's just a sort of being closed off, that it was restricted to those who were let in, and it wasn't very so inclusive. The whole openness means it's much more inclusive, so whereas education could be seen to be more exclusive because it's excluding people for a whole variety of reasons, good or ill, and now it can be more inclusive and it opens it up to more people. So there are all these trends happening. But what I would argue is that when we're talking about open education resources, we should say it's not just about the content. The content is a means to an end. This is about open communities as much as open content. And I just mentioned Facebook. Although there are some people who are autodidacts and who can seek out and search and find their own content and learn from the content and find that. Most of us really do prefer or enjoy in various ways of learning with peers in some way, learning from each other in different ways, whether it's structured, unstructured, loosely structured, whatever it might be, formal, informal, and things like that. So educational experiences generally tend to be communal ones, although it's obviously still personal to yourself. You're the one who's personally learning, but you might be doing it in a communal or social space. So that's important, and I think that shouldn't be forgotten. Because open educational resources are what you make of them. Because again, I talk about open access and open educational, but even an open educational resource, I mean, you can think about them both. They can be designed explicitly for educational use, or they can be other content used for educational purposes. We all know and use this. You might find things in a book, or a literature course, you're using books which are being published in some media courses, might be in films and things that are going to libraries and museums. It's just lots of other material out there which obviously is used for educational purposes. Now you can call them open education resources, but they're not designed for that purpose in mind. But does it matter? To a certain degree for the learner, probably not. They don't mind what it is, they just know it is something I'm using as a resource to help my studies, to help my learning process. But obviously as a teacher it can be important because it comes back to this licensing, is can I use that? Can I use that? Am I allowed to use that? Can I use that with my students? And all these things, can I share it with other people? And generally, open education resources can be found in funded institutional repositories. Open Learn from the Open University is one, but you could have from Nottingham. Here you could have MIT OpenCourseware, You can have, there's just too many of them. I'll talk about many more of those this afternoon. You can have funded and non-funded community-based initiatives. This is where you're not getting institution doing it, but you're getting community do it. Wiki Educator is an example of that. And although it's an institutional repository, in some ways you could say Connections in the States is a bit like that. It's more of a community-based. It's the community that drives it, even though there is an institutional backing for the platform. Or the Merlot set of repositories is like that. You've got proprietary channels, YouTube, iTunes U, and all these things. Yes, there are lots of Flickr, lots of openly licensed material on there, which are open educational resources, whether explicitly so or implicitly so. And you've got websites of projects, groups, and individuals, things that are going over that. So there's an awful lot of open educational resources out there, and it doesn't sort of take into account, as I say, a lot of open access resources, and there might be from museums, libraries, archives, other projects, which are not necessarily educational in intent, but can be used for that purpose. So now I want to come on to talking about the sort of what I could see as the different sort of stakeholders in open education resources, starting with individuals, moving through to institutions. And this is sort of based on a lot of the research and evaluation work that's been done to date, a lot of it here at the OU, but a lot of other institutions as well. What we feel from the sort of feedback and from what people are saying in terms of being interviewed, surveyed, and things like that, the sort of general things that come out. So for individuals, the greater availability and accessibility has helped them to learn new things or enrich other studies. I find that with Open Learn with Open University students, that they might have their programme of modules they're going to study sort of set out, and doing that says, I'd really like to have done this other module. But then they find that there's a sample of it on Open Learn and say, that's great. Actually, then between our other modules, they go and study that just as an enrichment. It doesn't count for credit, doesn't get anything like that, but it offers existing students an opportunity to look at, say, a module, course that they wanted to include in their programme, but they couldn't because the choice is too much. And they say, I can still get something from it. Enables them to share and discuss topics asynchronously or synchronously with other learners. Again, if I use OU students and Open Learn as an example, what you tend to find is that it's not just on Open Learn, but on Open Learn you've got the facility and the learning space with the forums, with all of the what we call study units, or the individual open educational resources. And obviously there are extracts taken from some of our courses. And so you'll get people who have studied a particular module or who have registered to study the next presentation of that module, who turn up on the Learning Space study unit and start conversations with fellow learners, fellow students about talking about what's the course like, what's it going to be like, and what the things like that. You get these mix of people. And you equally find that they sort of do that on Facebook, and many institutions find that students are doing it. But you can see that for your own students, the material that's up there can also be a mechanism for having other types of discussions which are not formal part of the module, the formal part of the study programme and calendar. So it offers that. But of course, because it's open, many other people can see it. It's not just those students. Other people can come in, people who might think, I'm thinking about studying this. I don't know whether I want to study at this university. I don't know whether to study this course. It offers them new insights, perhaps what it is to do higher education study and whether they want to do that. Because it enables them to assess whether they wish to participate in further formal education. This sort of happens at all levels. This is not just with a university. This is also, you can see this at school level. We've got examples and sort of case studies of where sixth form students and their sort of teachers are using material on Open Learn both to enrich their sort of A-level studies, or they're also using that as a way to help some of those students to think about whether they want to actually apply to go to university and what subject they want to do. So it just opens up and gives a richer understanding for a lot of people of what might be possible, as well as the intrinsic possibility that, I can just study this, I can learn this, or if I study this, I might get a head start on my course because this is available and the course doesn't start till for another 2 months. I can study this early, I'm well prepared before the course starts. So it helps them decide where they want to study, but it might also help them improve their work performance. We've also got examples of, and we know of, where employers and other organisations are pointing their employees towards certain study units that we have on the learning space of Open Learn and saying, this, you might find this useful as part of your career and professional development. And formally looking at that, but equally some individuals might say, I'm looking for some career aspirations, I want to do something, I need to improve on my presentations, or I find there's a study unit on giving better presentations. Simple like that. Oh, that's great, I can think that, I've just been made unemployed, there's material on here that might help me. If I study this, just give me a little bit of confidence, a little bit of extra knowledge, experience to apply for another job. So you can start seeing that type of things happening. So you're getting people using open education resources, and I say that's the way they can personalise why they're studying and what they're trying to get out of it to their own context, to their own needs. But equally, they can create or revise OER themselves. Now, not many people who see themselves as learners or students do that, but they do have that opportunity to do that if they want. Obviously, that's a big issue for teachers. Say, in terms of the sharing and being able to take other people's material, it's always the case that somebody never does it quite how you'd like to do it, and you say, well, it's good, but I'd actually want to change this, and I want to take this out and put something else in there. Of course, an open license on open education resources allows you to do that. So you can customise and adapt resources. You can translate them, freely translate them. We've got examples on Open Learn of people translating and adapting some of our study units. But hopefully, as I've already talked about, it will help create courses more efficiently and effectively. And particularly if we've got this thing that people want to use some of the, what we call rich media, the audiovisual materials, which can be costly to produce, difficult to produce, technically you think, I don't know how to do that, even though, with a lot of the technology now, it's possible to shoot a movie on your mobile phone. There's a bit on the radio only yesterday about how people have shot movies which have gone on general release using a mobile phone. Well, that's fine, but technically have you got the time and skills and things to do that in a way that's possible? But if somebody's already done it, you think, well, that's great, I can just pull that in, I can use that, I can embed that in my material, I can use that with students and things like that. So the openness allows you to access a lot of material and to increase perhaps the value of what your education resources you're providing for your students through that way. But it also helps to investigate in which others have taught their subject. One of the abiding features of much of higher education, it is that teachers do it alone, on the whole. We produce our own materials, we stand up, and the only people who see it are the students. Okay, you might get observations and things, but on the whole, your colleagues never see what it is you do. Some people like it like that, very happy, and say, I don't want to be showing up in front of my colleagues and things. I think they will think, but it's an individual, it's a solo-based opportunity. And yet, certainly in terms of producing educational resources here at the OU, everything is done in teams. We have teams of academics who argue and discuss and put those things together and critique and criticise. And really, in terms of open education resources, we've also got to, in terms of educators, move from the mindset of being thinking we're doing this on their own to thinking we need to collaborate and cooperate. This is about team teaching. Exactly how that is instantiated and how it's done is things that are still yet to be worked out in terms of asynchronously online, but it's good to be important because we generally find that the collective effort of a group of people usually produces a better result than what an individual does, because you've got that division of responsibility. You've got some people who can think about some aspects of it better than others, some much better on the pedagogical elements, some better on the actual knowledge content. So it's being able to create in collaboration with others important, but it's also being able to join in communities of practice better. I mean, there are obviously many communities of practice. Here in the UK, we have the subject centres, the Higher Education Academy. Well, we have at the moment. What's going to happen to them is another matter. But there are these communities of practice out there around subjects, and some work well, some don't work so well. But collaborating or cooperating around open educational resources can give a big focus to that, because really there's nothing like talking about something in concrete rather than in abstract terms around this that really helps out. I'm sure some of you might have been at conferences or discussions where everything's in rather abstract terms and you think that's all very well, but how does it improve my teaching? How does it improve the student experience? If you've got something, a focus to do it around, something you're doing, then generally it helps trigger and makes it much more real for people. So it's, for teachers, I feel that the advantages are of trying to move a teaching practice away from the individualistic solo effort to a much more community-supported basis, even if at the end of the day you still are like me standing up here doing it individually. But behind that, you've got that collaborative effort that you're building on and able to use and enhance what it is you're doing. If we then look at what OERs offer up for educational institutions, well, I've already talked a lot about it. Does showcase their teaching and even research programs to wider audiences. I mean, most universities have websites and try to showcase those things, but that content, high quality content, podcasts of their top researchers and things can give a different flavour and feel to some of that rather than standard web pages and things. It really sort of brings it to life. People can see a person, they can understand where it's coming from, and it can be quick and easy to do, and it just makes the showcasing of what the university is about much better. Through that, you can widen the pool of applicants for courses and programs. And I'll use the example of MIT, not the Open University there, where they've said over the 10 years that they have been running, they have noticed a change in the overall balance of who it is applies to MIT and from where and from what sort of social backgrounds. It has sort of changed some of the perceptions. MIT is one of the top Ivy League, things like that. It picks up the elite, but they do also have a big scholarship program, so people without any monies can sort of study there. But they have, as I say, they have seen a change in who is applying, and most of it they found through their surveys has been down to people through their open courseware realising or understanding, yes, that is something I think I can go there, and I think that's important. So I've already talked about hopefully lowering the lifetime costs of developing materials, but equally as well as the pool of applicants for students, this one could be equally important about collaborating with public and commercial organisations in new ways, including educational publishers. You never know when these things come up and when you might be able to forge a new partnership or collaboration with somebody which furthers the institution. Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, they've got an open courseware site. They started with their postgraduate program, master's program, and putting things out. They do, as a University of Technology, do a lot of engineering and sort of design and things like that. And they got a marine engineering program. They got materials up on that. They'd already got collaborations with many sort of companies and things around that. But they found in the sort of 3 years they've been running, they've had new contacts from other offshore marine companies who have found their open courseware and come and says, well, we'd like to collaborate with you and do some things with you. We think some research we need to get done on this. And their open courseware has been a trigger for them getting new contacts with commercial companies for, in this case, research programs, but equally it could be knowledge transfer, it could be other, could lead to sponsoring postgraduate students, PhD. It's just one of those things, again, it's about showcasing, but it offers new ways to work with people. And the educational publishers things, I think, is important because you have to think, I'll talk about this a bit more this afternoon, we've got this landscape of open publication coming largely from the public sector, not wholly from the public sector or publicly funded institutions, but of course there's a big commercial publishing industry out there, educational publishers, and you can see this is a threat to them. But equally, just like the music industry, educational publishers are beginning to understand that perhaps they need to change their business models. And we've found, because we already deal a lot with educational publishers in terms of using third-party material, we've been able to work with them closely, and they've been able to look at what we're doing and understand what might be the implications of making some of the content in the educational textbooks and things openly available. And some of them are beginning to make, say, a chapter of a textbook openly available under Creative Commons license. You have to buy the rest of the book, but they're starting to enter into the ideas about this. And there's even an educational publisher in the States, Flat World Knowledge, who's producing textbooks in which there is a freely available online Creative Commons license version. But if you want a printed version, you want it in any other format, you want to have any other additional material which is available and produced by the authors, then you have to pay for it. So that's how they're sort of getting a business model, sort of freemium model, which we'll talk about later. But it does mean that if educational publishers, commercial companies, private companies are beginning to make some of their resources available, again, it changes the type of relationships that universities might have in terms of, say, we want to use educational resources. Ooh, wouldn't it be nice if we can get from these media companies these nice video clips of this, that and the other, which we can use that previously we wouldn't have been able to, because it enriches the student experience. It also enables them to extend their outreach activities in a sort of fullest way, whole sets of way, and I've talked about some of those. But it's also, you'll find that, or certainly we found being a national institution across the whole of the UK, that staff in our regions are able to use open educational resources and open learn as part of the on-the-ground activities that they might do within museums and at festivals and things, showcasing what the Open University does and things like that. And again, it's all about making people aware of university, what it does, how it does it, and of course through alumni, through diaspora, it can be much wider, and obviously through the internet now and through iTunes U, that people around the world can know what it is that your institution is doing in different ways. And you never know, that person around the other side of the world might have been born within a few miles of your university and feel an allegiance to it, not because they went there, but because it was the local university and perhaps one of their parents was employed there or something. It's partly about sort of situating your university within your community, what you see as your community and your sort of diaspora and the alumni around the world and others helps with that. And lastly, another sort of stakeholder is governments and national agencies, because some of them, a bit like HEFCE through JISC and HEA here in the UK, but there have been other examples around the world where there's public money going into some programs and things like this. They need to feel that what are they getting in return from allocating some resources to this? Well, obviously in the UK's case, they're hoping to showcase the country's educational systems, saying we want overseas students, whether they come here or whether they're studying at a distance with other institutions. We want UKHE to be up there and among the best. So it showcases that, attracting international students. Also helping to drive educational practices. And I've talked about some of these things about that. I mean, I haven't posited that in terms of e-learning and the use of new technologies, but obviously technology-enhanced learning in all its ways, things are changing. We don't always know what is the best way to do things, but inevitably there is a lot more that can be done with technology to hopefully improve, enhance student learning experience or the opportunity for others to learn from those materials. And in terms of funding things like that, it's trying to drive the pace of looking at and institutions investigating and drawing on the best practice of others. It's part of what SCORE is here to do for Open Education Resources. We're trying to help share best practice, pull out best practice to share with others to try and jumpstart and move along those educational practices. This one, I think, worldwide is quite important because although there are commercial publishers out there, there are many cases where they don't publish things in minority languages. This offers actually the scope for governments to be able to get education resources possibly get translated into those minority languages. They'll pay for that bit of it, such that not everybody has to learn one of half a dozen global languages, but people can still study, and they might be able to create their own resources in their own minority languages, try and preserve that. I mean, there's great fears about the loss of languages around the world. Equally, developing education resources that reflect local cultures and priorities. Even in this open sharing mode, you'll find some people still thinking this is rather imperialistic approach, that here's this great material from the Open University, or what here's is why don't you use it around the world and things like that. And it's... And certainly that's not the intention, but obviously it can be seen like that because there are many places around the world which have just experienced that rather imperialistic, patronising attitude. Here's the good stuff, take it from us and you'll be better, rather than acknowledging that people might have some things they can do for themselves which might be as good, if not better. So being able to fund things that develops that local capacity is important. But equally, I think a lot that where we can help is to be able to cooperate internationally on common resources to meet common needs, to do that in a way which is not imperialistic. And I'll talk a little bit later this afternoon an example of that here that the OU's involved in, called TESSA, Teacher Education in Sub-Saharan Africa, where there was collaboration amongst about a dozen institutions from 9 sub-Saharan African countries, which was the co-development of the open education resources, a core set, which are then adaptable and usable by the different partners and institutions as they saw fit. So it was about developing local resources for local needs. We were just providing some of that help and expertise to get them started. Going to move on. A lot to cover. Does anybody have any questions at this stage? Because I'm covering a hell of a lot of material, so do say if you've got any questions at this stage while I take a drink. Wait for that.
Andy, you mentioned at the beginning it was quite expensive to produce OERs. I think that was the university 80 million, or I imagine that's course production. Was that at whole cost? And then in one of your slides, I think these slides are brilliant, by the way, can I have them? Lower the lifetime cost of developing educational resources? Is that sort of a long-term investment, or how does the two figures balance each other out?
Well, when I quoted the sort of 80 million, in context, the university's total turnover is about 430 million. So it's a big thing. But of that, it's always difficult to break it down because it's breaking down both most of that is obviously the staff time, academic staff time, other media staff time in terms of handling and producing the resources, but there are other sort of direct costs, and it covers everything. So it's but you also have to realise about something about the scale and quantities of resources that the Open University in this case is producing, of the high quality and things like that. So what you see on Open Learn, say Learning Space, on Open Learn there was 3 different sites. The new front end of it, you can see, Explore, it's got about 5,000 hours worth of sort of asset-based material on it. Learning Space has got about 6,000 study hours. The Lab Space has probably got about 10,000, in very rough terms. Now, a lot of the Lab Space stuff is legacy material, discontinued material, or other people's material. Now, what that represents is less than 3% of what you might call the university's educational catalogue. If you want to see what the sort of quantities, although a lot more is getting virtual and getting online, you see the sort of quantity of stuff that's relevant to one module or thing. So you just go to the OU library and you can see the shelves where they've got examples of copies of all the sort of specially prepared texts and things from a course. An individual courses come in boxes and things like this. If you've ever been an OU student, or you know somebody being an OU student, you know that you'll get a hell of a lot of material. Okay, that's being dematerialised a bit. There's much more online, but it's still, even when it's online, it's an awful lot of material. So it can seem a high cost, but the quantity is very high. Now, when I talked about sort of the lifetime costs, obviously that is a continued investment each year and every year for the total catalogue for the university. Obviously, the numbers of students we have on individual modules in the undergraduate programme, in most are 200, 300, 400, 500, 600. The biggest course is 8,000 on an individual presentation of module. It's just a different scale to most institutions. But if you're putting the effort and cost up front in the resources, you've got to defray that over, say, 8 years, 6, 8 years of the lifetime of that module before you might remake it. And now, we've had to sort of change, and we're trying to do this more continuous updating, but it's a big cost. Other institutions getting in distance learning find this themselves. There's also big costs in doing it and maintaining the materials like that, which is sort of different to all the individual lecturers having their own sets of material, which they do as well. Although rarely, most universities don't really sort of sit down and tot up the cost, the sort of time, cost and effort that all their individual academics spend on preparing teaching materials and delivering things. It would probably be a similar proportion to what the OU is spending in terms of total budget. So there's those elements to it which is different. So in terms of reducing the lifetime costs, there's an awful lot of time and effort can be spent on producing these bespoke materials. If it's easier to say, oh, we can pull something off the shelf that's already there, and although there might be this, say, 10 weeks of a course and we have to create 5 weeks of it, 5 weeks of it, we can slightly sort of take that and do it around it, then it means we're spending less time and effort doing that. And so that's what I mean about reducing the lifetime costs. But it's also not just the lifetime costs that if we produced it and somebody else used it, mean the cost saving for another institution or other way round is reduced. So it's generally about saying that for the sector as a whole, that we should be expending less effort as a whole in producing the educational resources. If we can collaborate on that, how many, well, you see it in the university, but how many different PowerPoint presentations, which covers the basics of mechanics or basics of physics, do we need to have? at higher levels, you might see there's more differentiation, but in the sort of basics things and basic mathematics things, you can say why there are so many different textbooks. There's just variations of it, and there are different ways of doing it. But it's an awful. There's probably a lot of. Well, if you look at in the United States, they always talk about. I mean, how many Physics 101s are there? You probably go to every university has this Physics 101 course, and you look at them all and line them all up, and it's very difficult to see what the difference is between many of them in terms of the resources, because it is such basic things. So if there's more sharing collaboration, that people didn't have to produce them, but they just teach to them, then they perhaps reduce those costs.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay, we'll go into now, must try and speed up to get through, is just set out also some thinking about the stages in doing open educational resource development, thinking about it from an institutional perspective or a group basis. That obviously when most people get started, this is what they spend most time on, is that legal one. It's about the sort of Creative Commons licensing. Everybody just thinks, oh, we don't know what to do. Can we do this? People say, should we do this? And things like that. They get stuck in the legal things. They think about the practical things, about how they're going to do that. Will faculty allow us to do this? Will they want to do this? How are we going to do this? They then, when they've got some of that sorted out, they're thinking about the technical aspects of how they're actually going to get that content out there. They do sort of start getting some thinking about the pedagogic side about this, which is pedagogically how are we providing this? Are these just individual assets out there? Is it a structured set of materials which need to be studied over a particular period? So there's a pedagogic framework to it. Do we make that explicit in what we put out there or not? You know, there's all sorts of things to start thinking about, but a lot more goes into those first elements, sort of touching into that. And then, as I've already mentioned before, people start getting the economic ones. Oh, we've got this little bit of grant money to get ourselves started, or we've got this little project to get started. We've got the website, we've got some materials up on it. Where's the money going to come from to pay to keep it going or roll it out or spend it? So it often gets set up front. I mean, a lot of the UK OER projects, they're meant to think about that, about their sustainability and things from the outset, and certainly for the institutional ones, institutions had to sign up to saying they'd try to embed and keep these things going in the long run. Of course, a lot of that was done before the full weight of the recent contraction in funding, or changes to funding to universities as higher education has happened. And so even though they might keep these things going, it might be on a very minimal basis, and it just sits there and doesn't really become of any great value to themselves, to their own institution, or to anybody else. So there's big elements to there. I mean, the next phase, which is really the most important one, I've already touched on this, is this being transformative, changing the ways of working and learning, and this is, again, part of the hopeful things, and certainly even with the GISC-HEO programs, they're trying to look for evidence of how these things are moving things forward. But of course, for most of the projects, they spend so much of their start-up phase getting through all this bit of it. They might start a little bit to think of it, they might be thinking about this. Really, it takes quite some time to get through to that sort of transformative element. Even here in the EU, you've been going 5 years. I can really only say we're only just starting on that. It takes some time. Also, some things going, we're just beginning to get into the position of mainstreaming like that. You'll hear from Scantlebury from the library. And the library now supporting, they've got a part of their website now which supports module teams, academics here at the EU, and being able to help identify, find open educational resources for inclusion in their modules. So this bit about us taking stuff in, we've only just got ourselves properly organised to be able to sort of try and look out there and find stuff and bring it in and do things ourselves, and to do some of that collaboration. We've got, as I explained this afternoon, a few projects which are also looking at this collaboration around producing materials internationally. What are the implications of that? How do you do that? How do you manage that? So again, it takes some time, but of course it's important to understand and look at what might be possible through that. Because this is how we talked about what we're doing on Open Learn almost very from the beginning, was that it's easy to say that there's lots of open educational content there. You can provide tools, platforms, devices to enable the content sharing out there. Got a website, you can get it out there. There's the content, there's a site, it's out there to share around there. But what you also need, what we try to foster and develop, is this sort of sense-making, this community discourse around it. You've got users, you've got people who are using it, you try to engage with them in some way, you try to understand how people are using these things to take it further, because you need to do this research and evaluation, you need to understand the user behaviour. It's one of the reasons why when we put together the grant proposal for the Hewlett Foundation, we built in that 15% of the total budget was dedicated to research and evaluation. Well, that was important, as you'll learn this afternoon. That's led on to a lot more research and evaluation projects and activities from that, because it's not enough. It wasn't enough just to do it. We really need to understand how we were doing it ourselves, all aspects of what we were doing, what users were doing, to really try and learn as many lessons as we can to see what is the value, where do we go from here, what do we do next. And I'll just go back over some of the things that some of the lessons that we have learned, picking up on some of the things I said, reasons why we went into opening resources. And this one about bridging informal and formal learning. One of the things which we were driven by is the idea of the learner comes first. We've particularly found out that in most cases that the content is the hook. I'll say a bit more about that, in the sense that for most people at this stage it's the content that people look for. And although with Open Learn we've got it in a Moodle-based platform, we've got these forums, we've got other communication and collaboration tools and things on there to try and create these communities of interest, communities of practice on that. Generally, it's the content most users initially, that's what they're searching for. But they like the flexibility of having those resources there, to be able to mix and match, so you possibly mix and match material on there, but also, as I mentioned, this mix and matching of their formal and informal studies. We did little case studies of users who had a quite varied sort of educational landscape of things they were doing during the period we were surveying them, in terms of some formal studies and informal studies, and we were able to understand how they were able to use Open Learn as a part of that bigger, wider landscape of learning as a mature adult, lifelong learner, doing different things. And in this case, somebody who's British but working in Spain and things like that. And although he was taking Spanish language courses in Spain, also studied the Spanish study units on Open Learn as part of that, and it was reinforcement. So again, it's they're able to do that, and it's the sort of self-pacing. It comes back to this, they've got a lot of control over what they're doing, match it to their own needs. And so it's important. But certainly, I've talked about this, that Open Learn does have some impacts on recruitment, preparation and progression of students. So it's about showcase what we're doing. Here's something from the Times Online about a guy called Daniel Conn, who had skipped university. When he left school, he puts it a bit unsure of my study skills, but he discovered Open Learn and then found out about the OEU and then signed up for some courses, and everybody was happy in terms of doing that. And so it was, again, this sort of progression of moving from a position where he wasn't sure what to do and he's looking for something. He found, in this case, Open Learn, and sort of moved on to study. But we know that many people do that They don't necessarily come on to study with the OU, they might go on and study with a local university, but it's prompted them to move from some informal study to formal study. But equally, we know from those people who we can track, who have been on Open Learn and said they've been on Open Learn, or said the reason they've registered for a course is because they'd looked at Open Learn, that obviously influences the reason for their studying. We know, following through, that some of them use it as preparation. Our advisory services, when people ring in saying they're thinking about doing this, we'll talk through to them. And in many cases, they might refer them to look at Open Learn. Particularly if English isn't their first language, they say, well, you want to practice your language skills, go and look at this. Or actually, this module you're thinking about taking has got quite a high mathematical content. What's your mathematical things? Well, here's some mathematical material from that course on there. Go and look at it, see what it's like. Can you cope with this? So there's all these types of things in which they can use our inquiry services, and our support staff can point both prospective and existing students to Open Learn to help them in their studies. So it's an adjunct to that. So it helps prepare them and helps with their progression and things like that. So it's as I already mentioned, it's the way that being open allows people to get a better understanding of types of study, what they can study, how they should study. Again, some of this is being able to get familiar with open and distance learning, because it's quite different to obviously what most people have been used to a schooling system, or even if they've been to university before. And this expands out a bit one of the things I talked about in terms of open learning. That with what we found when we surveyed a large number, about 2,000 of registered users on Open Learn, we were able to sort of cluster them into two groups. Ones we call volunteer students, and the people are coming in for the content because they wanted to study the content, they wanted to do the exercise, they wanted to submit work, but all their characteristics, even if they weren't signing up to be a student with the OU, they had all the characteristics of a typical OU student in terms of wanting the content, wanting to study it, they're wanting to have custom portfolios, they were wondering whether they could get any credit for being able to do this study. Can I convert what I'm doing here for free into other things? So they just felt very much like a student, and the content was the hook for them. There was a smaller group who we labelled social learners, who are more interested in not in that formal accreditation, but in ways in which they might be able to self-certificate and then also communicate and get in touch with fellow learners. Now, I think this is important because not just on here in Open Education Resources, but a lot of it obviously made about social networking sites and the social side of learning and how it is. It still seems to us that predominantly most people, when they're looking for stuff, are still after content and things. I want some content for whatever purpose it is, whether it's to learn this or whether it's, I've got an essay to do by next week, I need some source material. Oh, here's a nice little bit of source material I found in this study unit, and things I'll look at that, I'll use that and read that as doing things, whatever it might be. So that it is, we find it very difficult, despite all we've done, to get people to think about the social aspects, or to incorporate what they're doing, the social aspects. People seem to want to, as with many other studies that have shown with students, they want to keep their sort of studies separated from the social side. But there is this smaller group, whether it stayed a smaller group or whether there'd be a growing tendency for people to do that in future, we'll have to wait and see as people get more familiar with social networking and things. Collaborate and cooperate. I've already talked about some of these things. This is an example of one of those projects with some school teachers. This case in religious studies, ethics and philosophy. I say they used that, they adapted some of the material and used it for helping with their students. So it helps with this idea of preparation, curriculum extension, professional development, perhaps narrowing the digital divide, work-based learning, remote communities. A lot of things I've already talked about, that it offers ways of doing that, whether it's a very formal collaboration or whether it's things that happen, you don't know anything about it until they tell you, because they're able to use what you've made openly available. And also, as I said, this is about research and evaluation, so this has all been very important for us in terms of being a test bed to understand where people have been able to take material about the sort of different cultural settings. We've had material translated by collaborators in Brazil who've adapted and translated material and also made some of their material available in the lab space of Open Learn, and then they've actually run some courses on the back of that, between semester courses. They used it themselves as part of professional development for their own staff and developing, but it's all about informal collaboration. We might do some other wider collaborations with that university in future. It's sort of come about by this formal means. And so we're able to experiment and to look at the uptake of new technologies, all things that I've talked about before. And just to reinforce points made earlier, and again, coming from David Wiley, this is the key aspects of open education resources, the 4 R's of OER. We're to reuse, rework, remix, and redistribute. Generally, there's a lot of that, reuse. There's a little bit of that, rework. There's not much of the remix that's very visible, and there is some of the redistribution. So in terms of those 4 R's, I think we've also got a long way to go to see a lot more of the reworking and remixing. Despite all that's happened, despite these 10 years of the OER movement, it's still, most people are just using things as they find them, or just using them as is and not adapting them, and still a long way to go. Because I'll speed through this bit because there's a couple of minutes to go. It comes back to this idea about whether materials are there for an educational purpose or not. The educational materials are a mediating object between the teachers and learners. And so there's the interaction between the teachers producing the educational material and the learners using the educational material, between the teachers and learners at its most fundamental. In terms of practices, then there's different aspects of that teacher-content interaction, in terms of the purpose of the content, degree of meaning and sense-making in the content, how structured it is, and things. It's about the structure of the content and all these things, and it's also that community involvement, I say, whether you've got this element of cooperation and collaboration, team teaching, and other things going on. And of course, in terms of that, things, the learner-content interaction, you've got those aspects of the prior sense-making, what people already know when they come to it, levels of engagement they're making, being able to test that sense-making, augment that sense-making, and again, it's whether there is that community involvement. And then that really sort of throws up, in terms of open educational practices, the teacher-learner interaction. Is the teacher the course designer, the expert, the guide, the facilitator, an examiner? Yes. Are they that? Or are they more? So, rather rushing at the end here, but to finish, I think this is finishing up, the implications of open education resources for mediating that very more direct purpose of teaching and learning is granularity. Probably all be aware of this, but the smaller the size of it is, the easier people feel it is to reuse. And the bigger, the more integrated, and the more media they use, they feel the more difficult it is to be able to rework it and reuse. And particularly where you've got structured material, where there might be interdependence between bits of it. And of course, it gives more effort if you want to strip stuff out and put new stuff in, changing all the references. Because when you start thinking about resources and resources having a life of their own separate to their use within a sort of classroom or educational setting, then you have to be thinking about the appropriate mixes between the pedagogic support, what's built into the content, is there any pedagogic structures and things in there? Personal support, in other words, what do you think that the learner, the students, are able to do for themselves and help themselves doing that? Peer support, do they have anybody else they can talk to about it, fellow learners to do things like that? And then the professional support, expert reflection and guidance provided by teachers, lecturers and others in different ways. Of course, in most circumstances, you've got mixes of all those. When you've got just an open educational resources, then you've generally only got that first one. And so those, again, is a different way of a cut of what I've talked about before in terms of looking at it. Hopefully the use of new social computing technologies might be able to facilitate some of that support interaction. But really, I think I've hammered this home a bit, I think there's got to be greater sharing of practice amongst teachers and learners to move this on if open educational resources are going to last and sustain themselves. And yes, 2 minutes over. Thank you. Any questions on that?
Excuse me. Have you seen any evidence of people working from the granular level rather than creating learning objects that contain a number of assets which are interrelated to then be repurposed? Are you seeing any thought process where people are thinking at much more of the granular level and holding those individual assets in repositories which can then be taken and created and made up into a bigger learning object?
Well, there is quite a bit of that. If you see a lot of things that come out of the UK OER projects and that, they do vary a lot in terms of their sort of granularity. Many of them are individual assets, and of course if you're going to looking for resources in iTunes U or YouTube or sort of Flickr, you are generally looking at individual assets and license, and then it's again how you structure them together. I think one of the things there is about the types of assets and where they are and how available they are for reuse. On Learning Space of Open Learn, you can download the content in a number of formats, one of which is a zip file of just the assets. So if you just want to take the assets, you can do that. But of course, if you want to use those particular assets, it also depends upon your own technical skills and abilities to be able to take that material and reuse it in a new setting or to put it into whatever use you want to do it. So there are those sort of technical elements to it. Such that there is, but although people can do that, the issue I think which you're getting at is the one about learning design and about the sort of design of how you put together assets. And if people have put things together in a particular way, can you understand what is the design they've used so that you might be able to say, could I take that out and replace it easily, or how can I take this apart to reconstitute it in a new form that I want to use? There is quite a bit of work on that happening, and there are projects here at the U that have been working around learning design, and there's a lot of things on CloudWorks, which I mentioned this afternoon, which talk about that. And it is a sort of a big issue in terms of that. As I said, most people at the moment seem to prefer to be able to say, and even the sort of informal sharing that has gone on before this, it's around the asset level. It might be your PowerPoint slides, and it's very easy with these PowerPoint slides. I'm sure you've done it, I've done the same. There's some PowerPoint slides there, so are people's. Somebody says, can I borrow your have a slide, and you do that, and you say, I'll take that one, I'll take that one, I'll take that one, and mix and match. And it's easy to do that with a sort of PowerPoint presentation with a sort of linear structure like that, where they're all of the similar type. It's it's not so easy to do that if you're putting together sort of multiple media to do that. Because again, if it's just a text document, then it can be quite easy to cut and paste and move it around and sort of chop bits out and do things. I think the evidence to date is most people tend to do things in single media at a time. And although on PowerPoint, of course, you can include an animation, you can have a movie, things easily do that. So it's okay, it's easy to embed if it's something like a YouTube video, but generally people do work with those assets, and there is still a lot needs to be done to work out those aspects of pedagogy and learning design, of the practices that people go through. There's a lot of theory, but there's not what's been found out is the sort of practice of how people put stuff together doesn't match up to those nice, neat little theories people have had. So there's a lot of work trying to be done to understand it better.
You expect, or there is an expectation on subject matter experts to be pseudo-instructional designers as well, and have that sort of knowledge of, instruction, the pedagogy which goes with the resources, and of course that's not there really in most cases. So I just wondered whether you'd seen that changing mindset. And
I think it's beginning to be realised. That's why I ended up at the end. There's a lot more talk now about open educational practices, not about open educational resources. It's not about open educational resources. It's content. It's a means to an end. But the end should be about changes to the educational practices, both on the sort of teaching side and learning side, and it's how openness plays a part in that.
Thank you.
I just wondered whether we could talk a little bit about this sort of carrying on from that, the sort of fear of the unknown from every level, from the top level of the university, saying what is this, how is this going to affect business, and that sort of conflict between business model and the open model, all the way down through institutions, including staff, members of staff that might be even facing redundancy and looking at this like a threat. And it's kind of how you sort of navigate those obstacles, really, that change of mindset.
Well, there's a couple of things in there. The first is the openness itself, and the other thing is about sort of business models or strategies. I said at the beginning that in terms of open education resources or any aspect of openness, is that if you're going to do things like this, it has got to be aligned with the strategic aims and objectives of the institution. If it doesn't fit with what the institution is doing, then it won't survive. In a sense, it's not going to find traction. People have got to see that what its relevance is to whether it's supportive of the sort of teaching activities, the sort of outreach activities, or the research activities in different ways. Of course, different institutions will look at this in different ways. So first part of this is to say, what is this institution, what's its ethos, what's it trying to do? And then the second part is, how does the openness and open education resources, how might that add value to what that institution is trying to do? Now, there are many different arguments that can be made for that. On the teaching side, you say that there are arguments about the collaboration and cooperation in terms of reduced costs of development, or it might be improved teaching and student satisfaction that be gained from improved educational practices and perhaps publishing or using open education resources. It's about how you recruit, attract students and things like that, what they think about the institution through what you're doing. So you've got to think about all those different things, and do people feel that will add value to things that university wants to do? If they don't think it adds value, then they're not going to support it. That's for sure. So a lot of it is about what's the sales job, and some of those sales sales pitches in terms of what's the value. Some of them can be seen as short term, that obviously reputation, knowledge being seen there, perhaps having impacts on recruitment. You might be able to see that over a small time scale. Changes to educational practices and reductions in perhaps some costs or redirection of effort or impacts on student satisfaction could take longer. Now, the other aspect of this is the openness one. And I hope with what I've said so far, you can see that there are many people, not only students, but many more people, organisations, others, who do value the fact that an institution has got some of its resources out there and is sort of showcasing itself. They can start seeing and making contacts and ways of working with that institution in different ways. And so it's about seeing how it might also affect the relationships you have with existing collaborators and partners, and how it might be or how you do things differently. So it's got to be fundamental in terms of looking at this and saying that the openness, the very openness, aids both obviously communication and identification with the sort of ethos or the sort of mission of the institution. Now, if nothing else, put it another way, for MIT, you said, why do they need to do it? One of the big benefits that MIT has found for all those academics who've taken part is they now realise what all their colleagues are teaching. And they suddenly say, I see you're teaching that way in your course over there. No wonder the students I've been teaching that follow on from that have been confused, because I've been teaching things this way. Simple stuff, but it is this thing that the greater openness of it within an institution and externally, it sort of exposes those practices and gets people thinking about these things. Generally, we are too insular. Generally, we don't like monitoring. I mean, all the things about the quality QAA and all the quality reviews and things. On the whole, we say, we don't like this, but to a certain degree, that openness is important in terms of doing it. But it's doing it in the appropriate way, and certainly when you're being open, you just can't hide behind things. But that's not to say, in terms of assuaging people's fears, it's not saying, in terms of being open, it doesn't mean absolutely everything's open. It doesn't mean we're going to publish everything, giving everything away. It might only be a part of it. I mean, here at the OU, as I told you, we're only putting a part of it. It would cost us inordinate amounts of money to make all our content open, even if we wished to do so. It's just unfeasible in current circumstances. But it's just understanding what it is that openness provides for the institution, and that if they say, we're giving away the family silver, you say, go try and sell it. If they want to sell their content, go try and sell it. You see how well they do in the marketplace.
There's also that continuing sceptical dynamic between the institution and the staff. Just from my observations, I feel that the student voice could potentially be the
Yes.
the one that sort of breaks that ice, really,
Yes.
and says that this is why it's useful, because it does this.
I think I'd better stop
Yes,
it there.
yes,
Your coffee is waiting outside. There will be a chance to ask Andy further questions after the session this afternoon.